Hi folks, welcome to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again to talk to one of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi Jim, how are you doing?
Hi Douglas, hey everybody, I'm doing great. I've just got rid of the 2-year-old tyrant, so I'll now get some freedom.
Very good. Well folks, tonight's guest has joined us from Ontario, where he's gained a reputation for his research papers, his excellent research papers on many aspects of Robert Burns. Cronies everywhere, please welcome Professor David Murray. Hi David, how are you doing?
I'm doing not too badly.
Yeah. And how's life in Ontario?
Well, it's not so good just now. I'm living in a sort of retirement residence and we're confined to our apartments just now. There's been an outbreak of the dreaded virus, the COVID virus, in our community. So we're shut down just now. But anyway, thanks very much for inviting me to participate. It gives me great pleasure to talk to somebody.
Excellent. Well, you've watched some of these podcasts, so you know that we always ask the first question. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Okay. I was born in Peebles on the 28th of January, 1934. My father always told me that if I was born 3 days early, my first name would be Robert rather than David. I was named after a grandparent, but he said, Robert Burns, you're 3 days late. Anyway, I was born in Peebles, but I wasn't actually brought up in Peebles because my father was in the police. And he, just shortly after I was born, he was appointed as detective sergeant, and we went to Wishaw, the borough of Motherwell in Wishaw. So I spent the first 5 years growing up a wee bit in Wishaw. And at the outbreak of the war, my father was appointed, at that time he was an inspector, but he'd been appointed as the air raid precautions organizer for the borough of Motherwell and Wishaw. And as such, to be near the control room, which was down in Motherwell. So in late 1939, we moved to Motherwell, where I spent a fair chunk of my life growing up in Motherwell and living in Motherwell. I went to school there. The primary school was now top public school. And from there, I went to DL High School, where I spent 6 years there. I ended up actually as dux of the school. And then I was lucky enough to get a place in the Faculty of Medicine in Glasgow. So I became a medical student in 1951. And after 2 years of my studies, I was asked or invited or coerced into taking what was relatively new at that time, a double degree. You got the chance of taking a degree in one of the sciences in a short time, as well as the medical degree. So I chose biochemistry at the time because people told me that that'd be a good sort of calling card to get a job later on. So I finally graduated in 1959 with my medical degree and a BSc honours in biochemistry. And then at that time, to do, it was a compulsory thing before formal registration. I did 6 months at Stobhill Hospital as a house physician and 6 months at Glasgow Royal as a house surgeon, which was quite interesting. By that time, I had been involved with the Department of Pathology at the Royal Infirmary, and the professor there, an Ayrshire man from Muirkirk, one Tom Symington, later Sir Tom Symington, he sort of asked me to, if I would be interested in joining his department, which at that time was quite an honour, because a lot of my colleagues were looking around for jobs, but this was going to be a set job. So once it was formally registered, as a medical practitioner, I started training as a pathologist in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. 1961, 2 years into this, or a year into this training, I met my wife-to-be, Una. She was a student midwife in one of the hospitals affiliated with the Royal Infirmary Eastern District. It was called Duke Street at that time. She'd been a student nurse at the Royal. I never met her there at that time. I met her, and we got to like each other, and eventually we got married in 1962. We have four lovely children. We had a very happy 55 years of life together, but unfortunately, developed a bad respiratory disease, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, for which nobody knows what causes it, and unfortunately, there's no cure for it. And she died in 2017. But that's, I'm getting a wee bit ahead of myself there. As I say, I started training as a pathologist and I was sort of interested in academic pathology. I like teaching and I like doing research. So at that time, as well as to take the fellowship at the Royal College of Pathologists, which took a wee bit of studying, but I got it okay. But at that time, you had to take an extra degree to rise up the academic ranks. It was another degree. It was called BTA, the BTA degree, which meant been to America. So in 1965, I got a position as a visiting assistant professor at Stanford University, near San Francisco, and the west coast of California. We enjoyed that year, but we came back to Glasgow with a bit of itchy feet by that time, because when we coming back from Stanford, we traveled eastward across North America, got into Canada, and we'd arranged to sail from Montreal. At that time, it was almost as cheap sailing as it was to fly across the Atlantic. So we spent a few days in Montreal and really enjoyed Montreal as a city. Very cosmopolitan. My wife, as a student nurse, had gone across to France quite often. She enjoyed the French language. She was bilingual almost. So we visited McGill University at that time, because at that time there was an association between McGill University and Glasgow. Anyway, we went back to Glasgow. I was there I was 66. I was there for another 6 years. When one of my former colleagues, who was a wee bit older than me, he'd actually gone to McGill, to one of the teaching hospitals there, and he became chief of the department at the Montreal General, which is one of the big teaching hospitals in Montreal. So he invited me to take over his former position as a senior pathologist. And we spent quite a few months sort of cogitating, would we stay? Because we were quite happy in Glasgow. We actually lived in Kirkintilloch at that time, which was handy for the Royal. I could drive in there in about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But at that time, we had 3 of our children, and our house was bursting at the seams. So at that time, the market for houses in Scotland, or at least round about Glasgow, was pretty bare. And I think we looked at about 6 different houses, put in offers. And I don't know if you remember that, and I don't know if it's still the case, but every time you looked at a house, you had to try and arrange a mortgage, and you had to pay for a survey of the house. So it was £50 a time.
Yeah.
At that time, I was getting a bit fed up with this. But anyway, I thought, well, I'll have a look at Montreal. And at that time, houses were on the market. It was a buyer's market. It was just after the FLQ crisis, and some some people had left Quebec at that time. So that would solve a problem. And that was one of the reasons why we left. There was a kind of a sense of adventure. And I think at that time, there was a worry that there wasn't going to be enough fresh water, not so much in Scotland, but down in England, particularly in the Midlands. And there was talk about that time about sending Scottish water down to England, which really got my dander up. So we looked at the map, looked at Canada and saw Canada's full of fresh water. We're not going to run out of fresh water. Unless the people south of the border of us start draining the Great Lakes and so on. Anyway, one thing led to another, and we decided to come to Canada, to Montreal. And I spent 8 years there at McGill, which was good. We enjoyed it. And then there was a position that came up in Toronto. It was one of the chiefs of the teaching hospitals associated with the University of Toronto was retiring. It was suggested to me that I should apply, and I did apply, and lo and behold, I got the job. So that's how we moved from Montreal in 1980 to just outside, we lived just outside of Toronto, a place called Oakville, right on the lake shore of Lake Ontario. And we spent a number of happy years there. By that time, we'd added a Canadian, our fourth child, our second son. And so we have 2 girls and 2 boys. Our oldest is a boy, then 2 girls, and then a Canadian son. And they now have presented us with 10 grandchildren, 8 girls and 2 boys, which is an interesting sort of demographic. But then they're all quite doing well.
And are they all in Canada?
Our oldest girl is in Colorado Springs. She actually married a Canadian. She had trained in, she became a obstetrics and gynecologist, but she did a fellowship down in Kentucky in, I can't remember the name of the place in Kentucky. It was Lexington, Kentucky. And she became what's called an reproductive endocrinologist, which means she makes babies. So, and then she got a position associated with the University of Denver in Colorado Springs. So that's where they are, and that's where 3 of my grandchildren are. 1 grandson and 2 granddaughters who are now getting on. I have one of the granddaughters is going to be an engineer. The other one's going to be a dentist. That's the 2 girls, and the grandson he's going to be an engineer. But they're still training. So,
excellent.
So the other kids, my 2 boys, one's in Kitchener, Neil. He's our youngest, and he's in Kitchener, which is about 20 minutes from where I live in Guelph. He's information technology, the IT specialist.
One of these techie guys.
Yeah. And so he helps me quite a wee bit with that. My other son, he's the oldest. He's a gastroenterologist in Markham, which is about 60 miles east of here. So the 2 boys are in Ontario. Our second daughter, Morag, she's a sort of logistical planner and so on. She spends her time between Calgary and Kitimat. There's a big depot being built out there in Kitimat to handle liquefied natural gas for export to the Far East. And she's very actively involved in that, so that's why she's between.
Quite a variety of professions, and obviously there'll be a lot of detailed conversation when you all get together.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, of course, we haven't really got together for the last 2
Last
years.
couple of years.
Yeah, so we're actually, it means that this year is our 50th anniversary of coming to Canada. So we've been talking about having a big family reunion, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Hopefully be able to do that this year. That would be good.
Yeah. So
But
hopefully,
for 50 years and that Scots accent is still pretty strong.
well, my wife was she was Scottish. We kept each other up to date. And there's a fair Scottish diaspora in each of the places where we lived in Montreal. And we were in a sort of Scottish-speaking community. It was half Scots and half French Canadian, so it was interesting. And it was the same in Oakville. Our church, it was a Presbyterian church. There were a fair number of expat Scots, so you got to know a fair number of them. And everybody says I've got an accent. I always tell them it's not me that's got an accent, it's somebody else.
Oh, very good. Before we move on and start talking about your interest in Burns, let me tell you a little bit about something that I did that might interest you. When I retired, one of the things I did was to volunteer as a kind of business advisor to an organization called the Muirkirk Enterprise Group, right, which was a kind of local group to try and develop the village and such like. And one of the things that we got involved in was creating a memorial to Thomas Symington in Muirkirk.
Which Thomas? Which one was that?
The one that you're talking about.
Oh, very nice, very good.
So I just thought you might be interested in that. We aside.
Because his one of his, I don't know, it was one of his ancestors was the Symington that had built the first steamship, of which he was very proud. I think it was the one that Patrick Miller sailed on, or whatever. There's a question, did Burns ever sail on it? But
down at Bill Swinton.
Yeah. Well, that's, I hadn't heard of that. That's great, because Tom Symington was a great character, a very kind man, and a very, well, even as medical students, we used to call him the people's professor, because he was very down to earth. So that's very nice that.
Well, the next time I'm passing through Muirkirk, I'll take a photograph of it and send it to you.
Oh, that would be very good of you. Yeah,
I certainly will. Anyway, let's get back on what we wanted to talk about, which is your life with Robert Burns. And I'll ask Jim to lead the questioning on that part of our podcast.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, the first question is the same for most people. How did you get started with Burns?
Well, I suppose it was, well, I'd mentioned that when my father had said that I might have been called Robert if I'd been born on the 25th. He, as I say, was a policeman, and he was also a Freemason. So he was a Burns man, and I heard a lot about Burns in their house. And my mother was she played the piano. She was a good musician, and she used to say about Burns that he was a bit of a rogue, but he wrote beautiful songs, and she was fond of playing them. So even as a wee boy, I heard about Robert Burns. And then at school, particularly at Yale High School, our English teacher, who was a man called Scobie, he really enjoyed poetry of all sorts. And he really introduced me to the poetry was about, and particularly the poetry of Robert Burns. He sort of scandalized our class, though, at the time, because he said that Burns was really a second-rate poet, but he was the best that we ever had. But he didn't use that in a derogatory term. He was talking about Shakespeare and Virgil and Homer and so on. as and these people as the poets. And then the next layer down would be Robert Burns and Byron and Keats and so on. So I got really interested in Burns's poetry at that time. And then at Montreal General Hospital, there was some expat doctors and surgeons and some would-be Scottish people there. And when I went there, there was an established Burns Club in the hospital. It was all men, and it was limited to 12 people of Scottish extraction. But I managed to get in there. There was a vacancy, so I got in there. So that was the first Burns Club that I enjoyed, and I think that they joined the World Federation at one time. I don't know if it's still in the books there, but we had a Burns Club, and the main activity actually was every year we had a Burns supper, which was held in one of our houses. The wives, the ladies, would make the meal, and the gentlemen would sit down and enjoy the meal. It was a rather liquid sort of atmosphere, because each person had a bottle of either wine or whiskey at her beside her plates, and the entertainment was reciting some of Burns's poems. But one of the things was that somebody had to address the haggis, and somebody had to give tam o'shanter. Now, when I joined, the first year I was there, it was a man from Walkerburn, another borderer, Hobker was his name, and he addressed the haggis and did a very good recitation of tam o'shanter. By that time, a few drams had been drunk, and the thing about it was that everybody had a copy of the Burns's works. I remember my wife saying when we had the Burns supper at our house, she felt that the men were coming into a Bible study, because all the men were coming marching in with a book under their arm. So I inherited the task of addressing the haggis, which was not too bad, but then about an hour or so after the meal and after a few trams, I had to recite tam o'shanter. So to recite tam o'shanter in a kind of an alcoholic haze was quite a challenge, but I always managed it. But I was conscious of people sitting with their books and their fingers going along each line, just checking up on it. So I really got to know that poem, really enjoyed it. So that was the sort of real introduction to the works of Robert Burns, because people would just write or start reciting off their books just any poem that took their fancy. And then when we moved to into Toronto, we lived in the Lakeshore, as I say, in Oakville, and I think it was in 2001 when we were there, we got to hear about a relatively new Burns Club. That was the Halton Peel Burns Club, and we applied to join it, and we've really have enjoyed that ever since then. So it was actually when I retired. I mean, I had an interest in Burns, but not a deep interest. But when I retired, that was when I really started doing some research into it, and read a few papers to the Burns Club and so on. And I think I got a couple of them published in the Burns Chronicle, and I've spoken at various places and aspects of Robert Burns. So that's really my interest in it. I've got a fair number of books, or had a fair number of books about Burns. the various authors and so on. Unfortunately, I lost about half of them when I moved up. They moved into this community, but I've still got some, and I still have a book of my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, which is an interesting. It's a big book, and it's the complete works of Robert Burns with his correspondence, and the poetical works of Sir Walter Scott, which it's. I've never managed to read it from cover to cover because it's so rich, and particularly the correspondence and so on. It's an interesting book, but that's one that I could. It probably would take the rest of my life for me to read it from cover to cover.
What kind of what papers of research did you do? Can you give us a couple of them? And well, not in full, but
Well, that naturally, as you know, the background. I looked at the illnesses of Robert Burns and the cause of his death, and I had to agree with people that that Burns obviously had mental health issues, which is interesting that the people at the University of Glasgow now have published some stuff in that. But from reading about his adolescence and later on, some of his illnesses almost certainly were rheumatic fever. And this left him with a damaged heart. And then he got bad toothache. And almost certainly he got an infection of the distorted heart valves. And he died of bacterial endocarditis, which of course there's been a lot of dispute about that. I can remember we were at the Federation meeting, I think at the 2009, and David Purdy gave a paper on what killed Robin, and he mentioned a former colleague of mine, Watson Buchanan, who'd suggested that Burns maybe died of brucellosis, which was an interesting concept. But I don't think that would have explained the illnesses he had earlier on. So that's why I'm convinced that he had rheumatic fever, recurrent attacks of that, and then that's what eventually killed him, because of the infection of his heart valves from his bad teeth. I've also looked at, that was one that got published in the Chronicle, about Burns and the Covenanters. Because I was always very intrigued. I couldn't find, there was very little that Burns wrote about the Covenanters, which really surprised me, considering his background, Ayrshire, where, of course, the Covenanters, there was a lot of the activity of the Covenanters was there. So and Burns was so interested in the history of Scotland and the Covenanting movement. I mean, when it started, virtually more than half of the population of Scotland were really Covenanters. They'd signed on the Solemn Covenant. That's when Charles tried to make the Episcopal Church the Church of Scotland. And of course, most people got very upset about that and signed the Solemn League Covenant. So I was interested. There's only one wee poem that ever wrote about that. And there's a couple of vague references to it. So I started looking into that, and I couldn't see anybody else that's actually written about that. I don't know if anybody's thought about that, but anyway.
So David, for our audience, can you tell them which poem it was that referred to the Covenanters?
It's actually called, it's a wee poem, and I don't know if I've got it off by heart. It's called the Solemn League and Covenant. And you may see it. I should have read that up. I didn't know I'd get into this. I should have had it. It's only about a four-liner of it. I remember when I was presenting it, Ronnie O'Byrne produced a picture of it. It's on a plaque somewhere, but it's a very thoughtful one. But it says you might sneer at it, but they were, the Covenanters said that this was their conscience. So
Yeah.
he was, and it seems that in his mother's side, there was somebody who may well have been shot by Claverhouse, bloody Clavers. And that's what triggered with me, because Graham of Fintry was very proud to be a descendant of bloody Clavers. And I've got a feeling that Burns here was playing politics. He didn't want to say that he disapproved of the Covenanters and then signing with Graham of Fintry. But he didn't want to say that because some of his relatives might have jumped all over him. Some of the Ayrshire people might have jumped all over him. So he just left that part of Scottish history alone. And that was my sort of conclusion. I haven't heard, I think that was in the Burns Chronicle in 2016, up thereabout. And I've always kept thinking I might get some replies about it. There's some outraged person, but I never heard any more about it.
Oh, well, you maybe get a better response to this when people have watched you talking about it.
Well, I mean, it was I enjoyed looking at it. The other thing I did was, it was at Burns in Germany. Because it was interesting that I think the first, it was John Barleycorn was the first poem that was published in another language in Europe, and that was in Germany. The Germans really enjoyed John Barleycorn. I don't know whether it's because they like drink beer or what, but I did some work on that, and Goethe, the German poet and playwright and so on, he was very fond of, he got to know about Robert Burns through William Carlyle. So I wrote a paper about that. So that was.
And somebody mentioned that you did something on the Holy Fair as well. I'm interested because where I'm sitting at the moment is almost across the road from Malkin Kirkyard.
Oh, well, that was really just going through the poem and then sort of explaining the background of the various ministers and so on that were preaching, and just what the Holy Fair was about, and how by that time, I mean, Burns enjoyed writing about it because it was a sort of almost a drunken brawl that half the folk would go to the sermons and would fall asleep. And I mean, it's a brilliant poem, but it was also a brilliant sort of vignette of the different preachers and their theology at that time. And of course, there was the whole thing about the Old Licht and the New Licht and so on. It was an interesting poem. I also did one of my early ones I did was a sort of critique and a discussion of the Twa Dogs, which I'm still very fond of. In fact, I've got one of the paintings of the Twa Dogs sitting chatting to each other. The interesting thing was that we actually had 4 Newfoundland dogs, and of course Caesar, although he didn't say it was a Newfoundland, it came from where people fish for cod and the size of his lugs. So he obviously was a Newfoundland, the gentrified dog, but our Newfies would have fitted right into that category. They were gentlemen, very gentle dogs, but quite naughty dogs in their way, lovely big dogs. So the Twa Dogs, and it's interesting, that was the very first poem that he put into the Kilmarnock edition. And of course, there was the story of Lewis, his own dog, his sheepdog. So that too is a brilliant poem.
David, just to maybe change direction a wee touch if I can, because being an old detective, it's kind of difficult not to make some inquiries before you speak to somebody. And somebody tells me that as far as the Jim Connor Memorial Quiz is concerned, you might be one of the stars. Would that be correct?
Was that, sorry?
I'm saying somebody tells me at the Jim Connor Memorial Quiz at Rabanna, you might be one of the stars.
Oh, that was early on. That was the Jim Connor Rose Bowl. I think I won it I think about 4 years in a row, but the first 3 years I certainly at the quizzes I ran, I won it. I think some folk began to think there was some jookery-pookery going on there. Because it was because some of the quiz was made up by members of the Halton Peel Club. Jim Cunningham had started making them, but there was absolutely no collusion. So I was quite delighted because I'd met Jim Connor, the founder of Urbana. Actually, he was at one of our meetings at our house. He was an honorary member of the Halton Peel Burns Club, and it was interesting. It turned out, talking with them, that he actually also came. He was brought up in Motherwell, and he went to Glasgow, qualified in medicine. He was a bit, I think he was about 20 years older than me, or he was quite a bit older, so I didn't know him. But it was interesting to hear that he came from Motherwell and had done medicine as well. But he was a great Burns man, a great Burns scholar. So I was quite happy that I won that quiz 3 or 4 times. So my name's on, I think it's still on there. I haven't been at a Urbana meeting, obviously, for a wee while. And so Les Strachan, I think, has he's won it 2 or 3 times, but he and I were kind of our rivals for it. But my name, I think, is still on the trophy. And that was, well, somebody asked me, are you really clever or have you got a good memory? And I've pondered that through the years. I said it, a bit of both.
Oh, very good.
I'll tell you something else I've heard. I mean, was that you were looking into something to do with Burns and Mozart.
Oh, well, I mean, that's again, it started off because Mozart was born on the 27th of January. Burns was on the 25th, I was the 28th. And I think Byron was born on the 26th of January. So I thought there was something magical about that. But I started looking at the life of Burns and the life of Mozart. And there's some similarities. And obviously, both geniuses, both left the world these magnificent pieces of art. Both were fond of the ladies, and the ladies were fond of both of them. And the way that both of them died, there were all sorts of rumors about what caused Burns's death. Was he an alcoholic? Did he have died of venereal disease, or was he poisoned, or whatever? And the same thing with Mozart. Was he poisoned by Salieri and so on? So I started looking at that, and as I say, the idea of Burns was had rheumatic fever, and eventually died of bacterial endocarditis, both of which are caused by streptococcus, the rheumatic fever, by strep pyogenes, and things that give you sore throats and so on. And Burns kept having recurrent quinsies, as he called them at that time. And Mozart, his death has always been a bit of a mystery too. But there was a group of Americans, and they wrote a paper a few years ago. I've got the reference somewhere. They think that he died of glomerulonephritis, which is another disease that can complicate streptococcal infection, strep pyogenes. So here was these 2 men, birthdays close to each other, both geniuses, both fond of the women, and both dying as a result of this nasty wee bacterium, Strep pyogenes. So that's my association between Burns and Mozart. It's something that someday I'll maybe try to develop further, but it was just a little snippet that I had, and I mentioned it to 2 or 3 people. But I think there's interesting analogies or corollaries between Burns and Mozart. They were born three years apart, almost on the same day. And of course, Mozart also died a relatively young man. And it was just unfortunate for the world that if penicillin had been around, both Burns and Mozart would have lived much longer and given us many, many more classical poems and music. So that's my association of these 2.
Just, I mean, I don't want to put you in a spot here, but you've talked about reciting Tam O'Shanter. Is there any chance that you could give us a section of that? Obviously, the full poem's maybe 15, 16 minutes, but if you could maybe do some, could you do some of that? And if you can't, don't worry about it. We can...
Oh, the thing is that I'm trying to jump in the middle, but it's the sort of thing you've got to do when Chapman Billies leave the street and through the neighbours meet. As market days are wearing late and folk begin to tap the gate, while we sit boozing at the nappy and getting fou and unca happy, we think now of the long Scots miles, the water slaps and stiles that lie between us and our hame, where sits our salty, sullen dame, gathering her brews like gathering storm, nursing her lad wrath to keep it warm. And I could go on.
Well done. It's just I'm an addict. I can't help myself when anybody mentions Tam O'Shanter. I really need to hear a wee bit of it.
No, I mean that's. I mean, it's been said that if Burns had written nothing else, he still have been regarded as a genius. It's a magnificent poem. It's full of, a gentle dames at Garsby greet, to think how many counsels sweet, how many lengthened sage advices the husband for the wife despises. It's full of these little snippets. It was, but it's funny, it's humorous, but it has got a little sting to it. At the end, remember Tam O'Shanter's day there. It's a great piece of poetry.
In all the research you've done, are there any characters, either fictional or real, in the Burns story that you've come across that have particularly interested you?
Oh, that's an interesting. Well, the Tam O'Shanter himself is founded in somebody that I think that Burns met. I can't remember his name. David somebody. It was down in when Burns spent the summer in Kirkoswald.
Yeah.
There was a character nearby that that was supposed to be found, and it was the Shantor farm that they had, but his name wasn't Tam. It was
Douglas. It was Douglas Graham was his name. Sorry, Douglas Graham was his name in Head Shantor.
Yeah, that's right, Graham. Yeah, and his wife was a bit of a nag, apparently, but so that was the sort of archetype of Tam. I often wondered if he was still living, what he thought about the poem, whether he'd have shouted plagiary or something like that, or sued him for defamation of character. The other person right now that I'm trying to dig out a wee bit is Peggy Thompson. This is something I was sort of working it up for the Burns Club. It's that lovely song, song written in August, Now Westling Wind. It came up at, I think it was over the Harmony meeting. Anyway, I think it was Ronnie Byrne that brought it up, and I thought, I don't think anybody's talked about that poem. But then I started reading a bit about Peggy Thompson, and a question about, did Burns meet her later on, or when did he actually write that poem? And there's a wee bit of controversy there. But the interesting thing about Peggy Thompson, I mean, Burns described, he was in his 17th year, so he must have been 16. Actually, my grandfather's book said that he was 18 when he was in Kirkoswald, but I think the dates would go with the fact that he was 16 when he was there. So it's a question, how old was Peggy Thompson? And I think most authors suggest that she was 13 or 14. But then I've got another book that suggests that she was 17. So I took it on myself to look at the Scottish Registry to see if I could find Peggy Thompson of Kirkoswald. And I couldn't find a Peggy Thompson, but I found Margaret Thompson, which obviously was her real name, not from Kirkoswald, but from Daly, which I think is south. It's south of Kirkoswald.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in the parish there, it was in, it gives there's an entry there. I paid a few pounds to get hold of it. It mentions her father was a Robert, and I believe that Peggy Thompson's father was called Robert. But it's handwritten, and it's very difficult to read the writing. And also the other wee sort of mystery about Peggy Thompson, Margaret Thompson, was she a dry Thompson or a wet pot? You know, did she have a P in her name or not? And I always thought that she was a real Thompson. I had an aunt who was married to a Thompson. She said that the only Thompsons don't have a P in it. The other ones are gypsies, tinkers. Anyway.
So Jim Thompson, have you got any comment to make on that?
No, I mean, the problem is the P's and Anglification, which is
well, in the birth certificate or the birth record, the parish record, it looks as though somebody's tried to put a P in the Thompson, which I don't know. I mean, it's there in the Scottish Registry if anybody wants to go and look at it. But it's on the bucket list someday to get back to Scotland, to Edinburgh, go and see that, well, it isn't the original thing, but actually bring it up there. But the thing that, the image I got of it, it's quite difficult to read. And it says it's her father, Robert Thompson off, and then it's, I can't quite make it out of where it was, but it's in the Daily parish record. So that's a character that I'm really quite interested in, because it looks as though Burns met up with her later on. It may have been at Terbolton Kirk. They apparently sat together in church. There was a mysterious lady there, and it said that one of the books I have that says that she became a housekeeper at Coilsfield near Mauchline. So that I'm still working on that to try and work that out, and then work out when did he actually write that the lyrics of that song, because it's a lovely song.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So anyway, that's
still to come. That's for us all to wait for in a future chronicle.
Well, I don't know if somebody else has done the work. I haven't. haven't found much about it. I mean, you get people singing it, and it's a lovely song. Listening to it.
Well, if anyone's done the work, and hopefully they'll be watching this episode, so maybe they'll get in touch.
That's well, that'd be nice. That'd be nice to know. As I say, it's particularly this thing. Is that the right birth record that I've dug up? It cost me 6 credits, which was £7 or something like that.
Really, to work that out, you might need to check the parish boundaries, because, I mean, obviously, I mean, for example, I mean, there's all sorts of difference. You know, a place is a place, but it isn't in the parish records. It's the parish records, and it's the clerk of the parish that writes, puts the entry down.
Yes.
And to be honest with you, having looked through all these things myself, and I've been in the microfiche room here at the Burns Monument Museum quite a few times doing stuff. At times, quite honestly, David, it's really difficult to work out, because half of these folk, for example, if you take Mauchline Parish in the time of Burns, the local skill teacher was the clerk, and he was semi-literate. He couldn't spell Mauchline. You know, and if you take Willie Fisher is the only child of Willie Fisher's that's registered on a parish list, isn't he, in Mauchline? It's in Sorn after he moved to Tom Farm. So it's really quite difficult to work from that.
Yes.
And I would say the same thing. I mean, having looked at Newcomernots quite often, for, you know, to try and trace people, it's really difficult.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I don't know. That record I've got was it was in 1762, which would have made her 13 when Burns was in Kirkoswald. Now it's 17, as this other book that Half says she was. So it's and it was. I mean, there's another place that says that he may have actually written it for Jean Armour, but then sort of switched it to Peggy. But as I say, I haven't nailed that down. It's just an intriguing wee sort of vignette about it. So that's my next project.
Excellent. Well, David, we're coming to the end of the podcast, and I really just wanted to say how much we've enjoyed talking to you, and to remind the audience that you've sent out there a couple of wee posers about things that you'd like to find out about. So if there's anybody out there that can help, please get in touch.
Oh, that'll be good. Yeah. Well,
carry on.
Sorry, no. Well, I had another wee poser that, I mean, it's nothing to do with Peggy Thompson. It was when I was writing about Burns's illnesses and so on. It was the fact that someplace, and it's one of these things I remember reading about it, was the fact that Burns and Jean Armour's, that their kids, and particularly the girls, died relatively young. And of course, there was the 2 sets of twins, that the second set that died shortly after their birth, and the sister, the other twin of the Robert II, she died in infancy. And this thing that I read was that suggested that that Burns and Jean Armour actually were carriers of cystic fibrosis, because some of the other kids that Burns had, they've survived. So, and I can't trace that reference. I mean, somebody actually suggested this, which is an interesting thing. I remember being at here in Guelph at the university, there is the Centre for Scottish Studies. It's a very good centre. I think the book collection is rivals. It's the best collection of Scottish books this side of the Atlantic. And the former custodian of the Burns Museum came and talked to us about it, and he had a lock of Burns's hair. And I said, oh, could you get a DNA analysis of that? Because there's this suggestion that Burns was a carrier of cystic fibrosis. And he said it really couldn't be done like that. But I often wonder, maybe it still could be done. I mean, did he or did he not carry that recessive gene for cystic fibrosis? And that was why some of his kids died at a relatively young age of that disease. So that's another wee poser.
Wow, another mystery to finish us off. Well, folks, there, David's posed a number of questions about Burns and the Covenanters and who was Peggy Thompson, and whether the Burns family were carriers of cystic fibrosis. So lots of things to ponder. But in the meantime, just want to say thanks very much, David, for telling us all about your life with Robert Burns. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.